Does the desktop environment you use affect the speed of your computer? Which Linux desktop environment is the fastest? Which has the lowest system resource usage? In this video, we're going to look at 7 popular Linux desktop environments and compare the speed. We will take a look at CPU and RAM usage with no apps open, and then we will test how long it takes to open Firefox. These will all be tested on the same hardware, which is a computer with an Intel Celeron CPU and 4 GB of RAM. But before we start, thanks to DV for recommending this video. We will start with LXDE. This is one of the most lightweight desktop environments, so I'm expecting it to be pretty speedy with a low system resource usage. We get about 1 to 2% of CPU usage and a stunning 315 megabytes of RAM used. Now that is not a lot at all, especially on this hardware. It did take 6.77 seconds for Firefox to fully open. Of course, the quicker Firefox is open, the quicker you can purchase some JPT merch. Price is starting at just $12, available in any style and color you want. Link in the description below. Now moving on to LXQT. CPU usage seems to sit at around 10 to 15% and about 485 megabytes of RAM taken up with no apps open. Firefox took approximately 7.13 seconds to load. Overall, it was slightly slower and used just a bit more hardware power than LXDE. But let's be honest, if we're not looking at the stats and everything, you're probably not going to notice much of a difference. Now let's take a look at XFCE, another lightweight Linux desktop. CPU usage is roughly 3 to 5% and RAM usage is significantly higher than LXDE and LXQT, sitting at 731 megabytes. Firefox took 7.6 seconds to open. Moving on to Mate, the last of the lightweight Linux desktop environments. CPU usage rests at about 5%, give or take. The desktop occupies 744 megabytes of RAM. And while these specs are almost identical to XFCE, which is the one we reviewed previously, Mate managed to load Firefox in just 6.6 seconds, an entire second quicker than XFCE. But now let's give Cinnamon a try. The CPU tends to fluctuate between 5 to 10%. However, Cinnamon uses a full whopping gigabyte of RAM, significantly more than the others we've looked at so far. Now Firefox takes 7.75 seconds to load, which is the longest load time we've seen so far. Transitioning over to KDE Plasma. The CPU usage runs at about 5% with only 610 megabytes of RAM occupied, significantly less resource usage than Cinnamon. However, despite the low hardware usage, Firefox still took 9.6 seconds to load, which is by far the longest load time yet. And finally, we will test GNOME. CPU stats are again about 5%. The system uses about 910 megabytes of RAM and Firefox took exactly 7.9 seconds to load. The important thing to remember is that some variables, especially the CPU usage and load times, will kind of vary and fluctuate depending on the computer you use. On this hardware, an Intel Celeron CPU with 4 GB of RAM and a 64 GB SSD, here are the final standings. But in the end, faster isn't always better. Check out this video to find out why.